Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Attorney General, you've described the prosecution of Roger Stone as righteous. That's clearly something that the President and I disagree with you on. I would suggest that perhaps the prosecution of Andrew McCabe, who lied 4 times, thrice under the penalty of perjury, would be more righteous. I would suggest to you that uncovering the criminal conspiracy that existed where people in our own government were trying to convince intelligence agents and operatives around the world to destabilize our elections and to discredit our president would perhaps be more righteous. But as we sit here today, I don't think that Mr. Stone or Mr. McCabe or any of those other folks are killing anyone or burning down our buildings. And so I'd like to focus our effort on the most acute need I believe our country has. You've recently said that you believe Antifa to be a terrorist organization. What's your basis for that belief?
I'm not sure I said terrorist organization. I said we're investigating it as domestic terrorism. But Antifa, there are a number of violent extreme groups in the United States, and they're across the spectrum. Antifa is heavily represented in the recent riots. That's not to say they're the only group involved. And they have been identified as involved in a number of the violent mob actions that have taken place around the country.
And Mr. Attorney General, I saw the chairman of the Judiciary Committee recently say that Antifa is a myth, that their involvement in this violence isn't something that is real. What's your reaction to the chairman?
Well, I don't think it's a myth. Antifa can be best thought of, I think, as a umbrella term for what is essentially a movement comprised of loosely organized groups around the country. In some areas of the country, there are a number of groups, and there are sort of centers of activity. The groups, as I say, are loosely organized, but they are definitely organized. But since they have an anarchic temperament, they don't get along very well with each other. So I'm not suggesting it's a national organization that moves nationally. They tend to get organized for an event, and there's a lot of organization right before an event occurs, but we see a lot of the organization during the mob violence.
And that is a really important distinction when determining how to apply particularly our RICO laws to an organization like this. If Antifa is merely something that inspires people to go out and commit violence, that strikes me as legally distinct from Antifa being an organizing influence to assist people in committing crimes. One question I get from my constituents as they watch the death and violence and disruption and chaos in Seattle and in Portland and in other places is whether or not there's a risk that that could metastasize to other areas of the country. Have you given consideration to the risk that might befall other American communities if the Department of Justice were not to take action to protect and preserve federal property in places like Portland?
Yes, absolutely. You know, we are concerned about this problem metastasizing around the country. And so we feel that we have to, in a place like Portland, where we don't have the support of the local government, we have to take a stand and defend this federal property. We can't get to a level where we're going to accept these kinds of violent attacks on federal courts.
And if you did what my Democrat colleagues were asking, if you merely abandoned that federal property, allowed it to be overrun, allowed the people inside to be harmed, is it your view then that Antifa and other violent people engaged in these acts would simply stop, would simply accept that as their sole victory? Or is it your expert opinion, having dealt with a number of law enforcement and criminal cases in your legal career, that they wouldn't stop, that they would go to the next town, to the next community, and potentially inspire more violence?
There's no doubt in my mind that it would spread.
And what comfort can you give Americans in my district and around the country that you will stop this, that you will stop the burning and destruction of federal property, and that you will give confidence to regular Americans that they can go out in the streets without the risk of this terrorism?
Well, as you can see in Portland, we have a relatively small number of federal officers who have been withstanding this for almost 2 months. It's a great strain, but we cannot just stand aside and allow the federal court to be destroyed.
Thank you for your service and for your great work. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Attorney General Barr, you started your testimony with eloquent words about the life and legacy of John Lewis, fighting systematic racism, voter intimidation, civil rights. The one thing that you have in common with your two predecessors, both Attorney General Sessions and Attorney General Whitaker, is that when you all came here and brought your top staff, you brought no black people. That, sir, is systematic racism. That is exactly what John Lewis spent his life fighting. And so I would just suggest that actions speak louder than words, and you really should keep the name of the Honorable John Lewis out of the Department of Justice's mouth. Let me also say, you mentioned bogus Russiagate. In your opinion, as the Attorney General of the United States of America, did Russia interfere or attempt to interfere in the 2016 election?
Yes.
In your position as the Attorney General of the United States, is Russia attempting to interfere in the 2020 presidential election?
I think we have to assume that they are.
Thank you, sir. Now, let's talk about the integrity of the election, which is also something Congressman Lewis fought for. Jared Kushner implied that the president could move the election day. Can a sitting U.S. president move an election day?
Actually, I haven't looked into that question under the Constitution.
Well, 2 U.S. Code Section 7 says federal election day is the Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So if you take that as a correct statute, is there any executive action by a president?
I've never been asked the question before. I've never looked into it.
As Attorney General of the United States, do you believe that this 2020 presidential election will be rigged?
I have no reason to think it will be.
President Trump tweeted that the election will be rigged, but he also tweeted that when he was losing to Hillary Clinton, and he tweeted that a day after Fox showed that he was losing to Trump. But I don't want to be too political. Do you believe, as the Attorney General of the United States, that mail-in voting will lead to massive voter fraud?
I think there's a high risk that it will.
Do you ever vote by mail-in ballot?
Apparently I did once at least.
But you believe that other people voting by mail could lead to massive fraud?
No, what I've talked about, made very clear, is that I'm not talking about accommodations to people who have to be out of the state or have some particular need not to, inability to go and vote. What I'm talking about is the wholesale conversion of election to mail-in voting.
You do understand that African Americans disproportionately do not survive COVID-19 coronavirus. You are aware of that?
I didn't hear the question.
You are aware that African Americans, black people, disproportionately die from COVID-19 coronavirus, correct?
Yes, I think that's right.
And not that it would be the first time that African Americans would risk their lives to vote in this country to preserve its democracy. But the suggestion is that them having the ability to vote by mail would somehow lead to massive voter fraud, but I won't stick to that.
No, I didn't say that. I just state, I think, what is a reality, which is that if you have wholesale mail-in voting, it substantially increases the risk of fraud.
But it doesn't make it likely.
That's all I said.
Now, I also saw on TV that the president said he's not sure that he'll accept the election results. Can a president just protest because he lost an election?
Protest in what sense?
Well, can he contest an election just because he simply loses?
Well, Gore versus, Bush v. Gore was.
Well, I think that was over a slim voter margin. I'm talking about if it is very clear that the president has lost an election, does he have a remedy to contest the election?
Not that I'm aware of.
Let me go back to what Representative Bass mentioned. You mentioned the number that there were 8 African Americans killed by the police and 11 white people killed by the police.
So far this year?
If you use those numbers, that's 85% of that population is white, 15% of that population is black. But if you actually look at the deaths, according to the numbers you just gave, 42% of the deaths are African American and 58% are white. That is a glaring disparity in terms of population, and I just give you those numbers.
Well, not necessarily.
Because
I
I
have to adjust it by the race of the criminal perpetrator.
No, I just did that for you. I'm using your numbers, and according to your numbers, African Americans are 4 or 5 times more likely than their percentage of the population to be killed by police than their white counterparts. I just wanted to give you that based on your numbers.
Actually, the studies I've seen have suggested 2 things. One, that in fact, police are less likely to shoot at a black suspect, a little bit more likely to shoot at white. However, that police are more inclined to use non-lethal force in a contact with an African American suspect. So those are in terms of the statistics, that's what it looks like to me.
Any data that you have that shows that African Americans are less likely to die at the hands of police or be shot or shot at, to me is a incorrect analysis. But I am interested in seeing it. So if you have it, please see it. I won't call it any names. But if that data exists, I would be more than happy to see it. And since you're sending me that data, can you send me the data of African Americans